The congressional hearing room fell dead silent as Mitt Romney leaned into his microphone, his gray suit pristine and his expression cold. What he said next would trigger one of the most explosive political confrontations of the year. "Representative Crockett," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I have to question whether someone with your limited experience should really be lecturing seasoned lawmakers about constitutional law." The 33-year-old congresswoman from Texas sat perfectly still, her eyes never leaving Romney's face. But what Jasmine Crockett pulled out next would leave the former presidential candidate completely speechless and turn a routine hearing into a viral political earthquake that would dominate headlines for weeks. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happens when establishment politics meets the new generation of fighters. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was the moment when old guard Republican privilege crashed headfirst into the brilliant, legal mind of a woman who'd had enough of being underestimated. And Romney? He was about to learn that questioning Jasmine Crockett's credentials was the biggest mistake of his political career. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why this moment mattered so much to millions of Americans watching. Mitt Romney, the 77-year-old Utah senator who spent decades in the upper echelons of American politics. Former governor of Massachusetts, 2012 Republican presidential nominee, and heir to a political dynasty worth hundreds of millions. Romney represents everything about the old Republican establishment. Wealthy, privileged, and used to talking down to anyone he considers beneath his status. He'd built his entire career on the assumption that his Harvard MBA and family connections made him untouchable. Romney's path to power had been paved with advantages that most Americans could never imagine. Born into wealth, educated at elite institutions, and surrounded by influential connections from birth, he'd never had to prove himself in the way that ordinary people do. His business success at Bain Capital came through leveraging financial resources and networks that were handed to him, not earned through merit alone. In recent years, Romney had positioned himself as the principled conservative who occasionally criticized Trump, but this moderate image masked a deeper arrogance about his own intellectual superiority. He genuinely believed that his Ivy League background and corporate experience made him more qualified to discuss complex issues than lawmakers who had actually specialized in those areas. For months, Romney had been growing increasingly frustrated with the new wave of young Democratic lawmakers who weren't afraid to challenge Republican orthodoxy. He particularly bristled at representatives like Crockett, who combined brilliant legal minds with fearless attitudes. Romney saw them as upstarts who needed to be put in their place, threats to the established order where seniority and connections determined who deserved respect. What really bothered Romney about lawmakers like Crockett wasn't just their policies. It was their refusal to show the deference he felt entitled to. They didn't seem impressed by his resume or intimidated by his status. They treated him like any other colleague who had to earn respect through the quality of his arguments rather than the prestige of his background. Jasmine Crockett, the 33-year-old powerhouse from Texas who'd taken Washington by storm. A former civil rights attorney with a law degree who'd spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms before bringing that same fire to Congress. Crockett represents everything the establishment fears. She's young, brilliant, unafraid, and completely unwilling to show deference to people just because they've been in power longer. Unlike Romney's privileged background, Crockett earned everything through merit. She'd worked her way through law school, built a successful practice defending people who couldn't defend themselves, and won her congressional seat by connecting with working families who felt abandoned by career politicians. Her legal practice hadn't been about corporate mergers or financial arrangements. It had been about standing in courtrooms defending constitutional rights for people who had nowhere else to turn. Crockett's courtroom experience had taught her to never back down from bullies, whether they wore judicial robes or expensive suits. She'd faced down federal prosecutors, corporate attorneys, and hostile judges who tried to intimidate her into submission. Each victory had strengthened her confidence and sharpened her ability to dismantle opponents who underestimated her. Her journey to Congress hadn't been typical either. While Romney had used family connections and personal wealth to launch his political career, Crockett had built a grassroots movement based on her track record of fighting for ordinary people. Voters didn't support her because of her last name or her bank account. They supported her because they'd seen her win cases that protected their rights. What made Crockett particularly dangerous to establishment politicians like Romney was her combination of legal expertise and political fearlessness. She understood constitutional law better than most senators, but she also had the courtroom-tested confidence to articulate that knowledge in hostile environments. She'd spent years explaining complex legal concepts to juries of ordinary citizens, making her exceptionally skilled at communicating sophisticated ideas in accessible ways. This wasn't just about two politicians disagreeing. This was about whether the old guard could still intimidate and silence the new generation of leaders through condescension and implied superiority. For Romney, this was about maintaining the established hierarchy where experience meant more than expertise, where seniority commanded automatic respect regardless of actual qualifications. Romney's attack represented the last gasps of a political culture that had dominated Washington for decades, one where elite credentials and institutional connections mattered more than proven competence. He was fighting to preserve a system where people like him could dismiss people like Crockett simply by invoking their years of service and establishment credentials. For Crockett, this was about proving that young lawmakers, especially young women of color, deserved respect based on their qualifications, not deference based on their supposed place in the political pecking order. Her response would determine whether merit could triumph over privilege, whether expertise could overcome establishment bias. The hearing room was packed with staff, lobbyists, and journalists who sensed tension building. Romney had clearly planned this moment, choosing what he thought would be an easy target. Crockett had spent years preparing for moments exactly like this one, not because she wanted confrontation, but because she'd learned that backing down from bullies only encouraged more bullying. The constitutional law hearing had been routine until Romney decided to make it personal. The committee was discussing voting rights legislation when Crockett offered a detailed legal analysis of recent court decisions. Her presentation was thorough, citing case law and constitutional precedents with the precision of someone who'd actually practiced law at the highest levels. Crockett had been explaining the intricacies of constitutional interpretation when she referenced a lesser-known appeals court decision that had significant implications for voting rights enforcement. Her analysis was so precise and detailed that several committee members were taking notes, clearly impressed by her command of the legal material. That's when Romney made his first move. "Representative Crockett," he interrupted, not even waiting for her to finish her statement. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm, I think it's important for this committee to hear from members who have more substantial experience with these complex constitutional issues." The room tensed immediately. Several committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Romney's tone wasn't just dismissive, it was patronizing in a way that made everyone present understand this was about more than policy disagreements. The word enthusiasm dripped with condescension, as if Crockett's detailed legal analysis was nothing more than youthful eagerness. A few staffers in the back of the room exchanged glances. This kind of dismissal was exactly what many had feared would happen when young lawmakers tried to engage seriously with constitutional issues. Romney's interruption felt calculated, designed to undermine Crockett's authority in front of the committee and the cameras. Crockett paused, her pen still in hand, looking directly at Romney. "Senator Romney, I'd be happy to discuss my experience. Would you like to start with my law degree or my years practicing constitutional law in federal court?" Her response was measured but carried an edge that suggested she wasn't going to accept dismissal quietly. Several Democratic committee members perked up, recognizing the subtle challenge in her tone. Romney's smile was cold. "Oh, I'm sure you have impressive credentials on paper. But there's a difference between academic knowledge and the kind of real-world experience that comes from decades of public service. Some of us have been working on these issues since before you were born." The phrase "on paper" was particularly cutting, suggesting that Crockett's qualifications were somehow theoretical rather than practical. The age reference was even worse, a direct attempt to diminish her credibility based on something completely irrelevant to her expertise. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Romney had just dismissed not only Crockett's legal expertise, but implied that her age and relatively recent arrival in Congress disqualified her from serious consideration. Several Democratic committee members looked shocked at the blatant disrespect. One actually shook his head in visible disapproval, but Romney wasn't finished. He was clearly enjoying what he perceived as his dominant position in the exchange. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged by anyone he considered beneath him. "I've been involved in constitutional law at the highest levels for 30 years, he continued, his voice gaining strength from what he perceived as his winning position. "I've advised presidents, worked with constitutional scholars, and helped shape legislation that affects millions of Americans. I think the American people deserve to hear from representatives who understand the weight of these decisions." Romney's emphasis on weight was particularly condescending, implying that Crockett couldn't possibly understand the gravity of constitutional issues. He gestured broadly as he spoke, as if addressing the entire room rather than responding to a specific legal point that Crockett had raised. The implication was crystal clear. Crockett was too young, too inexperienced, and too new to deserve a seat at the table with serious lawmakers like himself. Romney had essentially told her to sit down and let the adults handle the conversation. His body language radiated the kind of dismissive arrogance that comes from decades of being treated as the smartest person in every room. Other Republicans on the committee began nodding along, sensing an opportunity to diminish one of the Democrats' most effective voices. The conservative gallery started murmuring approvingly. Romney had successfully framed the moment as experienced leadership versus youthful inexperience. Several conservative staffers were already pulling out their phones, anticipating that this would become a talking point about respecting institutional wisdom. What made Romney's attack particularly galling was the timing. Crockett had just delivered one of the most sophisticated analyses of constitutional law that the committee had heard all session, demonstrating exactly the kind of legal expertise that should have earned respect rather than dismissal. Instead, Romney had chosen to focus on irrelevant factors like age and tenure. Crockett sat quietly through the entire attack, making notes on her legal pad. Her expression remained calm, but everyone in the room could sense something building. She wasn't shrinking from the confrontation. She was preparing for it. Her pen moved steadily across the page as if she was organizing her thoughts for what was coming next. The silence stretched for several seconds after Romney finished speaking. The tension in the room was palpable. Other committee members seemed to be holding their breath, unsure whether Crockett would respond defensively or simply accept the dismissal. "Are you finished, Senator Romney?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. "Because I'd like to respond to your concerns about my qualifications." The question was perfectly polite, but carried an undertone that suggested Romney might want to reconsider what he'd just done. Her tone was that of someone who was about to educate rather than defend, a subtle but important distinction that Romney completely missed. Romney gestured magnanimously, clearly confident he'd already won the exchange. "Of course, Representative. The floor is yours." His casual dismissiveness in granting her permission to respond showed just how little he thought of her ability to challenge his characterization. He settled back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd just scored a decisive political point. What Romney didn't know was that he'd just walked directly into a trap that Crockett had been preparing her entire career to spring. He'd questioned the wrong person's credentials, and he was about to pay the price in front of a national audience. The committee room fell silent as Crockett organized her notes. Even the stenographer stopped typing, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Romney sat back in his chair, still smiling, completely unaware that his political reputation was about to be systematically dismantled by someone he'd just dismissed as inexperienced. Staff members throughout the room seemed to sense the shift in energy. Phones were discreetly positioned to capture whatever was about to happen. The moment felt pregnant with possibility, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something significant. Crockett looked up from her notes, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years arguing cases in front of judges who demanded precision and proof. Senator Romney, since you've questioned my experience, let me walk you through exactly what qualifies me to discuss constitutional law in this committee. She opened a folder that had been sitting quietly beside her throughout Romney's attack. You mentioned your 30 years of experience. Let me tell you about mine. I earned my law degree with honors, specializing in constitutional and civil rights law. But unlike some people in this room, I didn't just study constitutional law, I practiced it. For 8 years before coming to Congress, I represented clients whose constitutional rights had been violated by government overreach. Romney's smile began to fade as he realized this wasn't going to be the apologetic response he'd expected. I've argued constitutional cases in federal district court, federal appeals court, and yes, even before the highest court in the land. I've won landmark cases that established new precedents for voting rights, due process, and equal protection under the law. Cases that are now taught in law schools across the country. She pulled out a document and held it up. This is a copy of my Supreme Court brief from the case that overturned a discriminatory voting law that was suppressing the rights of thousands of Americans. I wrote every word of it myself. How many Supreme Court briefs have you authored, Senator? Romney! The question hung in the air like a challenge. Romney opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. But let's talk about practical experience, since you seem to think that matters more than actual expertise. You said you've advised presidents. Well, I've done something better. I've fought for Americans whose constitutional rights were being trampled by presidents. I've stood in federal court and argued against Department of Justice attorneys who were trying to defend unconstitutional policies. She pulled out another document. This is a federal court decision where the judge cited my arguments to strike down an executive order that violated the First Amendment rights of religious minorities. The judge specifically noted the thoroughness of my constitutional analysis. I wasn't advising power. I was fighting it when it overstepped its bounds. Romney's face was starting to flush. This wasn't the respectful deference he was used to, receiving from junior lawmakers. You mentioned working with constitutional scholars, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. I've done more than work with them. I've been cited by them. Harvard Law Review published my analysis of 14th Amendment jurisprudence. Yale Law Journal quoted my work on voting rights enforcement. Constitutional scholars don't just work with me, Senator Romney. They cite my research in their own work. She reached for another folder. But since you seem impressed by titles and positions, let me share something else. Before coming to Congress, I was invited to teach constitutional law at 2 different law schools. I turned both positions down because I was too busy actually practicing constitutional law in courtrooms where real people's rights were on the line. The room was completely silent now. Romney was staring at the documents Crockett had spread across the table, clearly not having expected this level of detailed response. You want to talk about the weight of constitutional decisions? Crockett's voice took on an edge. I've held the constitutional rights of American citizens in my hands. I've stood before federal judges and argued for the fundamental freedoms that make this country what it is. I've won cases that protected the voting rights of thousands of people. I've defended the religious liberty of communities that had no other voice. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Senator Romney, when was the last time you personally argued a constitutional law case? When was the last time you wrote a legal brief defending someone's constitutional rights? When was the last time you stood in a courtroom and fought for the Constitution instead of just talking about it in political speeches? Romney's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in decades, he was completely speechless. "The difference between us, Senator," Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her courtroom experience, "is that you've spent 30 years talking about constitutional law in political settings where you could win through seniority and connections. I've spent the last decade proving my understanding of constitutional law in federal courtrooms, where judges don't care about your family name or your political connections. They only care about whether you know the law." She gathered her documents. "So when you question my experience, what you're really doing is dismissing the 8 years I spent in courtrooms defending the Constitution against government overreach. You're dismissing the Supreme Court cases I've worked on. You're dismissing the constitutional precedents I've helped establish. You're dismissing the actual legal expertise that got me elected to this position." The silence in the room was deafening. Romney looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His confident smile was completely gone, replaced by the pale expression of someone who'd just realized he'd picked a fight with someone far more qualified than himself. "Senator Romney," Crockett said, her voice now calm and professional again, "if you'd like to continue this discussion about constitutional law, I'm happy to engage. But let's do it based on legal merit and constitutional knowledge, not assumptions, about who deserves respect based on how long they've held political office." Romney stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at his notes. When he looked back up, his entire demeanor had changed. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like embarrassment. I appreciate your clarification of your background, Representative Crockett," he finally managed, his voice much quieter than before. But Crockett wasn't quite done. "Senator, there's one more thing I think this committee should know about experience versus expertise." She pulled out one final document. "This is a letter from the American Bar Association's Constitutional Law section. They invited me to serve on their executive committee based on my expertise in constitutional litigation. I was the youngest person ever invited to serve in that position." She looked directly at Romney. "The legal community recognized my constitutional law expertise years before I ever ran for Congress. They didn't care about my age or my political connections. They cared about my knowledge of the law and my track record of defending constitutional rights." Romney slumped back in his chair, completely deflated. The man who had started this exchange by questioning Crockett's qualifications now looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Now," Crockett said, returning to her original presentation materials, "would you like me to continue my constitutional analysis of the voting rights legislation? Or do you have other questions about my qualifications?" The aftermath of Crockett's systematic dismantling of Romney's attack began immediately. As soon as the hearing recessed, smartphones across the room lit up with notifications. Staffers, journalists, and observers who had witnessed the exchange began furiously typing and sharing what they'd just seen. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media like wildfire. The hashtag #JaiRCrockettDestroys started trending within the first hour, followed quickly by "Nash Romney schooled and Nash constitutional expert." The contrast between Romney's condescending dismissal and Crockett's detailed, fact-based response created the kind of David versus Goliath narrative that captures public attention instantly. Romney left the hearing room without speaking to reporters, his staff quickly ushering him past the cameras that had been waiting to capture reaction quotes. His office declined all interview requests for the rest of the day, citing scheduling conflicts. For a politician who built his career on projecting competence and authority, the visible defeat was devastating. Democratic lawmakers immediately rallied around Crockett's performance. Within hours, senior Democrats were sharing clips of her response and praising her handling of Romney's attack. "This is what happens when expertise meets arrogance," tweeted one senior Democratic senator. "Representative Crockett just gave a masterclass in constitutional law while defending herself against completely inappropriate attacks." Progressive organizations seized on the moment as validation of their support for young, qualified candidates who refused to be intimidated by establishment politicians. Legal advocacy groups particularly celebrated seeing one of their own successfully defending both her credentials and her right to be taken seriously in constitutional discussions. News outlets struggled to frame the story in ways that didn't make Romney look completely outmatched. Conservative media initially tried to portray the exchange as disrespectful toward a senior senator, but even their coverage couldn't ignore the substance of Crockett's response. Liberal outlets celebrated it as a perfect example of merit defeating privilege. Legal experts who reviewed the exchange were unanimous in their assessment. Crockett's credentials were indeed exceptional for someone her age, and Romney's attack had been both inappropriate and factually baseless. Several constitutional law professors went on record stating that Crockett's background would qualify her to teach constitutional law at major universities, making Romney's dismissal particularly tone-deaf. The most damaging coverage for Romney came from legal journalists who took the time to verify Crockett's claims about her background. Every single credential she'd cited checked out perfectly. Her Supreme Court brief was publicly available and had indeed been instrumental in overturning discriminatory voting laws. Her law review articles were real and had been cited by other scholars. Her invitation to serve on the American Bar Association's constitutional law section was verified and unprecedented for someone her age. The confrontation crystallized several ongoing tensions in American politics. For many observers, it represented the clash between old guard politicians who expected deference based on seniority versus a new generation of lawmakers who demanded respect based on qualifications and merit. Women's advocacy groups particularly seized on the exchange as an example of how successful women, especially young women of color, face constant challenges to their credibility that their male colleagues never encounter. The fact that Crockett had to present a detailed defense of qualifications that clearly exceeded those of many senior lawmakers highlighted the double standards that persist in political discourse. The moment also underscored the changing nature of political expertise. Romney represented the traditional path to political authority, family connections, business success, and long tenure in office. Crockett represented a different model, specialized expertise, courtroom experience, and the ability to defend positions with detailed factual knowledge rather than political rhetoric. 3 days after the hearing, Romney's office released a statement attempting to clarify his remarks. Senator Romney has great respect for Representative Crockett's legal background and looks forward to working with her on constitutional issues, the statement read. But the damage was already done. Political observers noted that the statement conspicuously avoided any acknowledgement that his original comments had been inappropriate or inaccurate. The carefully worded statement actually made things worse for Romney because it highlighted his inability to offer a genuine apology. Political commentators immediately pointed out that acknowledging Crockett's legal background after publicly questioning her qualifications seemed patronizing rather than respectful. The phrase, "looks forward to working with her," rang hollow, given that he had just attempted to exclude her from serious constitutional discussions. Romney's communications team had clearly struggled with how to respond. Internal sources later revealed that multiple drafts of the statement had been written and discarded, with Romney himself reportedly resistant to acknowledging that he had made any error. His refusal to admit mistake reflected the same arrogance that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. Romney's allies tried to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, suggesting he had simply been trying to emphasize the value of legislative experience. But recordings of his original comments made it clear that he had specifically questioned Crockett's qualifications and implied she lacked the standing to participate in serious constitutional discussions. The attempted damage control became a secondary embarrassment when reporters began asking Romney's staff whether the senator had actually reviewed Crockett's credentials before questioning them. The staff's inability to provide a clear answer suggested that Romney had made his attack based on assumptions rather than facts, exactly the kind of careless approach that Crockett had exposed during the hearing. For Crockett, the exchange became a defining moment that elevated her profile nationally. Speaking requests poured in from legal organizations, universities, and political groups wanting to hear from the Congresswoman who had so effectively defended both her credentials and her principles. Within 48 hours of the confrontation, Crockett's congressional office received over 200 speaking requests from law schools, bar associations, and professional organizations across the country. Her staff had to create a new system just to manage the overwhelming demand for her appearances. Major universities began competing to have her deliver commencement addresses, recognizing that her story resonated powerfully with young graduates entering competitive professional fields. The American Bar Association invited her to deliver the keynote address at their annual Constitutional Law Conference, making her the youngest person ever to receive that honor. When she accepted, the conference sold out within hours, an unprecedented response that highlighted how her confrontation with Romney had elevated her status within the legal community. Legal advocacy organizations particularly embraced her story, with several groups launching mentorship programs specifically designed to help young attorneys develop the kind of professional confidence that Crockett had demonstrated. The Crockett method became shorthand for systematic credential defense in professional settings. More importantly, the moment established Crockett as someone who wouldn't be intimidated by senior lawmakers attempting to diminish her voice. Other young lawmakers, particularly women and people of color, reached out to thank her for demonstrating how to respond to condescending attacks with facts and confidence rather than defensiveness. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement praising Crockett's response and noting that her approach provided a model for how their members could respond to similar attacks. Several senior Democratic lawmakers publicly stated that they wished they had shown similar backbone when facing dismissive treatment earlier in their careers. Constitutional law experts began referring to the exchange as a textbook example of how substantive expertise could triumph over political posturing. Law schools started using clips of Crockett's response to teach students about effective legal argumentation and professional confidence. Her systematic presentation of credentials became a standard template taught in advocacy courses across the country. The moment also caught the attention of international observers. Legal professionals in other countries began studying the exchange as an example of how democratic institutions could be strengthened when qualified individuals refused to accept dismissive treatment based on irrelevant characteristics like age or tenure. The Romney-Crockett confrontation became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating opponents based on superficial characteristics like age or tenure. Political strategists began advising their clients to thoroughly research the backgrounds of lawmakers before challenging their qualifications, noting that assumptions about experience could backfire spectacularly. Within weeks of the exchange, several political consulting firms had created new protocols for vetting the backgrounds of potential debate opponents. Opposition research took on new meaning as consultants realized that attacking someone's qualifications without understanding their actual credentials could result in devastating public humiliation. The exchange also spawned academic analysis from political science departments across the country. Universities began using the Romney-Crockett confrontation as a case study in political communication, examining how assumptions about authority and expertise can be weaponized and countered in public discourse. For the broader political landscape, the exchange demonstrated that the new generation of lawmakers was bringing different types of expertise to Congress. Unlike previous generations who might have deferred to senior colleagues, these representatives were prepared to defend their qualifications with detailed evidence and weren't intimidated by traditional hierarchies. The confrontation particularly resonated with young professionals across various fields who had experienced similar dismissals based on age rather than merit. Law firms reported increased interest in public service careers, with many young attorneys citing Crockett's example as inspiration for bringing their expertise to political arenas. The moment also highlighted how social media had changed political accountability. Romney's dismissive comments might have passed unnoticed in previous eras, but the immediate viral spread of Crockett's response ensured that millions of Americans witnessed both the attack and the devastating response in real time. Political communication experts noted that the exchange represented a new model for how public figures could respond to unfair attacks. Rather than accepting dismissal or responding emotionally, Crockett had demonstrated the power of systematic, fact-based responses that left opponents with no room for further attack. The incident also prompted discussions about institutional respect versus earned respect in political settings. Traditional political culture had long operated on the assumption that seniority automatically conferred authority, but Crockett's response suggested that expertise and proven competence should carry equal or greater weight. As the dust settled from the confrontation, political observers began speculating about what the exchange meant for future interactions between established politicians and the new generation of lawmakers. Would senior politicians become more careful about challenging the credentials of younger colleagues? Would the new generation feel more empowered to defend themselves against condescending attacks? The answer seemed to come in subsequent committee hearings, where several junior lawmakers appeared more confident in defending their expertise when challenged by senior colleagues. The Crockett model, responding to dismissive attacks with detailed evidence of qualifications, began appearing in other political confrontations. One particularly notable incident occurred just 2 weeks later when another senior Republican attempted to dismiss a young Democratic representative's expertise on environmental policy. The young lawmaker immediately responded by detailing his environmental science PhD, his published research on climate change, and his work with international environmental organizations. The senior Republican quickly backed down, clearly having learned from Romney's public humiliation. The ripple effects extended beyond Congress. Young professionals in corporate settings began adopting similar strategies when facing age-based dismissals, coming prepared with detailed documentation of their qualifications and achievements. Management. Consulting firms reported an increase in requests for training on credential defense strategies for younger employees facing workplace bias. Legal advocacy organizations particularly embraced the Crockett model, encouraging young attorneys to document and articulate their qualifications clearly when facing dismissive treatment from more senior colleagues or opposing counsel. Bar associations began incorporating sessions on professional confidence and credential presentation into their continuing education programs. The exchange also influenced how political campaigns approached candidate preparation. Campaign managers began dedicating more time to helping candidates, particularly young ones, organize and present their qualifications in compelling ways. The ability to respond to credential attacks became a standard component of debate preparation. Months later, the Romney-Crockett exchange was still being referenced in political discussions about respect, expertise, and generational change in American politics. For many observers, it represented a turning point where traditional assumptions about political hierarchy met the reality of a new generation of highly qualified lawmakers who refused to accept dismissive treatment. The confrontation also became a standard reference point for discussions about implicit bias in political settings, particularly the tendency to question the qualifications of young women and people of color in ways that would never be applied to their white male colleagues. Law schools across the country began incorporating the exchange into their curricula, using it as an example of effective advocacy and professional confidence under pressure. Students studying constitutional law could now watch real-time footage of someone defending both legal expertise and professional dignity simultaneously. Corporate training programs also adopted elements of the Crockett response model, teaching employees how to document and present their qualifications when facing workplace discrimination or dismissive treatment. Human resources departments reported increased requests for training on how to handle situations where employee credentials were questioned inappropriately. The exchange became particularly influential in legal circles, where young attorneys often faced similar dismissals from senior colleagues who assumed age correlated with inexperience. Bar associations began hosting seminars on credential confidence and professional self-advocacy, directly inspired by Crockett's systematic approach to defending her qualifications. Political science textbooks started including the Romney-Crockett confrontation as a case study in political communication, power dynamics, and the changing nature of authority in democratic institutions. Students could analyze how assumptions about expertise and experience could be challenged through factual documentation and confident presentation. The moment also influenced judicial proceedings, with several young attorneys reporting that they had successfully used similar strategies when facing condescending treatment from opposing counsel, or even judges who questioned their qualifications based on appearance rather than demonstrated competence. Don't forget to subscribe.